One of the foundational stories that we find in the Torah at the very beginning is that of Cain and Abel. It is a story that is well known to many. Abel is a shepherd, and Cain is a farmer. And they both bring forth offerings to God. Abel brings forth the firstlings of his flock, and Cain brings the blessings of the field. And yet, God accepts Abel's offering, but not Cain's. And in the hurt of rejection and the feeling of a lack of love, Cain turns to his brother, invites him out into the field, and kills him. And when God comes forth and says, "Hey Hevel, Achicha, where is Abel, your brother?" Cain turns to him and says, "Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper?" The story as it unfolds is very clear that God certainly thinks, yes, Cain was to be his brother's keeper. And there are myriads of laws that follow, primarily in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that show that indeed we do have a responsibility towards our brother when they are in financial distress, when they are in need, when they require our help. We are to be there, and we are to love them and to care for them. However, the story begs many questions, and one of them is just this: is it only our brethren for whom we are responsible? Is it only for our brothers that we are to show such care and compassion? Now, the Torah does say that we are not allowed to oppress the stranger, for we ourselves understand their pain, for we ourselves were oppressed when we were strangers in a strange land. But that only deals with the negative. It does not talk about our responsibilities to do for them, only what we can't do to them. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we obligated, have a sense of responsibility to those who are not our brethren, to those who are not related to us, to those who are not intertwined within our lives, to those who are nothing more than passerbys in our own existence? At the end of this week's Torah portion, the Torah begins addressing just this question. The shedding of blood, as we see in the story of Cain and Abel, was considered to be an unbelievably egregious sin, such that God says to Cain, "The blood of your brother cries out from the very earth." And so the Torah understood that the blood, symbolizing the very life force of a person, if shed within the land of Israel, would pollute and desecrate the land. And so in chapter 21, in the book of Deuteronomy, the very last verses of the Torah reading for today, we read about a situation, about a person who is found out in an open field, dead, a stranger, an innocent in the eyes of the Torah. And with their death and the shedding of blood, the land has now become polluted. And there must be a way of addressing that pollution. And so what the Torah outlines is the following ritual. It says that you are to measure from all the surrounding towns which town is the closest. And there being no witness and no knowledge of this person and no knowledge of who committed the crime, the town that is closest to that dead body takes responsibility. And the elders of that town go to an ever-flowing oasis or wadi, ever-flowing one that has never been plowed or sown. And they take a heifer, and they break the neck of the heifer, and the elders of the town come forward, and they wash their hands, and they declare, "We have not raised our hand against this person, nor have we seen his death. Absolve us from this crime." Now, we can talk about the efficacy of such rituals in removing the sense of pollution of the shedding of blood. But what I'd like to focus on this morning is a different element of the ritual, the declaration of the elders themselves. The rabbis going back 2,000 years in the Mishnah on Sota, which is, the Mishnah is that first layer, that first level of rabbinic law, they ask a very interesting question. They say, is it possible? Do we really think that the elders really committed this murder? Do we think that they gave witness to this crime and did not try to stop it? They must have. So how are we to understand the declaration that they say, we have not committed this murder, we have not seen this happen? If we understand from the very beginning that clearly they did not do either of these things. And they come back and they say, this is what the declaration really means. When they say they did not do this, when they say they did not witness this, what they're really saying, the rabbis say, is he came not into our hands that we should have dismissed him without sustenance, and that we did not see him and let him leave without an escort. In other words, in their declaration, they're not taking responsibility for the murder itself. Rather, they're saying that if we had seen him, if he had been in our town, of course we would have provided him with sustenance. And if we had seen him in our town leaving, of course we would have never let him go alone into the open fields, but we would have provided an escort for him. In this sense, what their declaration in the Torah shows, and that the rabbis elucidate for us, is this acceptance of broad responsibility on the part of the elders for anyone who walked within the walls of their town, anyone who was within their vicinity. And so we understand that knowledge of an injustice or a situation that is filled with imminent danger creates a responsibility for us to act, to help the other, not just our brother. In fact, the Hebrew word itself for responsibility, achrayut, contains within it the word acher, other. However, let us understand that this mitzvah of our responsibility to people not just who are an integral part of our lives, but are strangers and passerbys, this responsibility is not just a mitzvah that is interested in good social policy. On the contrary, later rabbis understood that the mitzvah, that the midah, that the quality of bearing the burden of the other was a foundational and essential quality to develop within ourselves if we are to grow and become not just good, decent citizens, but good, moral people. And so we see that Rabbi Isaac Luria, the 16th century Kabbalist, whose thought was so original in the ethereal realms of Kabbalah that he founded what is considered a separate and individual, unique school of Kabbalah. That this man who spent time contemplating the heavens used to say, before he would begin his prayer, before he would say the Baruch Hu, he would say phrase from the Torah, V'yahavta l're'echa kamocha, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And if you open up our Sidurim, after I finish talking, if you open up our Sidurim to a page not numbered, right before the Baruch Hu, you will see this phrase. And why is it? Why did he say the commandment from Leviticus that we should love our brothers, we should love our neighbors, we should love the other like ourselves prior to praying? Because he knew you couldn't stand before God if all you were thinking about was how good you and God have it. That the only way to stand before God is to understand one's obligation to the other. And 3 centuries later, a very different rabbi with a very different approach to Judaism, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who was the founder of the Musar movement. The Musar movement being this movement devoted to an intense focus on the minutiae of daily life and understanding that each minutiae requires us to engage it at the highest ethical level. That Rabbi Yisrael Salanter used to say that the material needs of the other are an obligation on my spiritual life. And his student, also from the 19th century, Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv, also known as the Alter of Kelm, the Elder of Kelm, took this notion of responsibility and said that bearing the burden of the other is the most crucial midah, the most crucial quality that any of us can develop towards being better human beings. And so he made it the foundation of his system. And he used to train his students. And he used to tell them that each and every day they must go out and figure out some way to bear someone else's burden for them in some way, shape, or form. Each and every day, that was to be the way that they must approach their lives. And he understood this as being so crucial on a spiritual level, because he understood the insights that we see from the Torah through Rabbinic Judaism, that we see throughout almost all religious traditions. That the biggest obstacle that we place before ourselves towards bringing holiness into our lives and leading holy lives is our ego, our sense of self, the story that we tell ourselves that places us at the very center of the universe at all times. He understood that it wasn't just enough to be spiritual. For as we understand in our day, that to just be spiritual, to just focus on being spiritual as being a beautiful sunset, or yoga, or meditation, or sitting in shul and praying, that's not enough. That's not spiritual if it doesn't engage the other and raise them up as well. On the contrary, if there is no sense of responsibility, then that kind of spirituality is nothing but another form of narcissism and self-centeredness. In his book, East of Eden, which is a rather long midrash on the story of Cain and Abel, John Steinbeck writes in a section it almost feels like it's just a separate part of the story, and you really sense that this is not a character speaking, but John Steinbeck himself. He writes that I remember clearly 3 deaths of 3 men. He says, I remember the death of the richest man of my century, a man who built up his wealth, and in doing so, angered and hurt all around him, treated them terribly, walked all over them. And even though he amassed a tremendous fortune, and even though he spent his life after he amassed this fortune giving it away and probably doing as many good deeds as he did evil, when he died, there was a collective sigh of relief, he writes, with people saying, thank God. And he says, I remember a smart man, smart as Satan, he notes, A man who manipulated and used people to get them to love him and do whatever it is that he wanted them to do. And when he died, even though people sung his praise beneath their breath, they also uttered words of gladness that he was dead. And John Steinbeck writes, I remember a third man, a man who made many, many errors in his performance, but whose effective life was devoted to making men brave and dignified and good in a time of a fearful cynicism when others were seeking to use and manipulate them. A time not so different than our own. And when this man who devoted himself towards building up the other, when this man died, while there were a few who hated him, most all cried and wailed, "What will we do now?" In this small section, John Steinbeck concludes, we have only one story. All novels, all poetry are built on the never-ending contest in ourselves between good and evil. And it occurs to me, he says, that evil must constantly respawn, while virtue is immortal. For us to be able to tap into that immortal virtue, for us to be able to awaken within ourselves a sense of the good so that we may prevail in that context that is the story of all people from the time of Cain and Abel. If we wish to live lives that are worthwhile and meaningful, if we wish to live a life such that when we die, people will feel truly pained, then we must let Cain's question become ours on a daily basis. We must ask ourselves continually, am I my brother's keeper? And let us all pray that we answer it better than Cain did. Shabbat Shalom.